"You don't belong in Arthur Hale's workshop." The inspector folded the notice and slapped it against the door. "A veteran with a dog can't restore a town landmark." Mason didn't answer. Ranger stood between him and the locked entrance, staring at the floorboards inside, like he heard a heartbeat under the wood. "Step away," the inspector said. Mason whispered, "Ranger, what is it?" The dog pressed his paw to one dark plank. Then the whole building breathed. One low note rolled through the walls. Everyone went still. To understand why that sound mattered, you have to know what Mason bought for $1. Mason Whitaker had not come to Bellwether Falls looking for a miracle. At 41, he had learned to distrust words that sounded too clean, too polished, too willing to promise what life rarely delivered. He came with a dented pickup, 2 duffel bags, a toolbox that had survived 3 deployments and 2 coast-to-coast moves, and a German shepherd named Ranger, riding in the passenger seat like an old sergeant who had seen enough of the world to stop being impressed by it. The road out of town curved past a boarded-up feed store, a chapel with peeling white paint, and a line of cottonwoods leaning toward the creek as if they had been listening to secrets for 100 years. It was early October in western Oregon, not cold, not warm. The kind of morning that smelled of damp cedar, cut grass, and rain still deciding whether to fall. Mason drove slowly, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near Ranger's shoulder. The dog sat upright, sable coat brushed by the open window's wind, ears forward, eyes fixed on the road ahead. He had once worked search sites after floods and earthquakes, places where houses forgot their shapes and streets forgot their names. Now his muzzle had silver around it, and his hips were slower than they used to be. But there was still a quiet command in him. Ranger did not waste movement. He did not bark at passing trucks, did not lunge at squirrels, did not stir unless the world said something worth hearing. Mason trusted that about him. Truth be told, Mason trusted it more than he trusted himself. The county notice had been taped crookedly inside the Bellwether Falls courthouse 2 weeks earlier, between a flyer for a fall pie auction and a faded announcement about road work on Philstone Road. Former Hale Pipeworks. County surplus. Minimum $1. The clerk had looked at Mason twice when he filled out the paperwork, as though she wanted to ask whether he understood what he was buying. He understood enough. A boarded-up organ workshop, 3 acres of overgrown grass, a sagging roof, no warranty, no utilities guaranteed. No promise except the legal transfer of a property nobody else wanted. Mason had signed anyway. He had spent too many years watching useful things get abandoned because they looked tired from the outside. He knew what people did with tired things. They named them damaged, then stepped around them. The lane turned to gravel a mile past town, climbing toward a low ridge where maples had begun to bronze at the edges. Ranger shifted before Mason saw the building. His ears rose another inch, his nose tilted toward the windshield. Mason glanced over. "What is it, boy?" Ranger did not look at him. The workshop appeared after the next bend, crouched behind blackberry vines and tall grass gone silver at the tips. Hale Pipeworks was larger than Mason expected. A long board and batten building, with a stone foundation, high narrow windows, and a square cupola whose louvers had gone gray with weather. The sign above the main door still held the ghost of painted letters. Hale Pipeworks, hand-built organs and repair. One hinge on the loading door had rusted red. Ivy had climbed the east wall. The place looked less like it had died than like it had been holding its breath for a very long time. Mason parked near the front steps but did not get out right away. For a moment he simply sat there, feeling the old familiar heaviness settle behind his ribs. He had bought a building because it was easier than admitting he had been looking for somewhere to belong. Ranger gave one low breath, not a whine, not a warning, just a sound like a hand placed gently on a table. Then he stood, paws braced against the truck floor, staring at the workshop door. Mason opened his own door first. Gravel clicked under his boots. The air was still except for the soft tick of the cooling engine and the dry whisper of leaves along the fence line. He walked around, opened Ranger's door, and the dog stepped down carefully, nose already working. They climbed the 3 front steps together. Mason took out the key the county had given him. It looked too small for a place with that much silence inside. Before he could put it in the lock, Ranger froze. Every muscle in the dog's back went still. His ears sharpened toward the door, but his eyes lowered, not to the knob, not to the windows, but to the boards beneath their feet. Mason stopped too. Years of training, some useful and some he wished he could forget, had taught him to listen when Ranger listened. At first, there was nothing, just the wind pushing lightly through the grass, a crow calling once from the ridge, the far-off murmur of a truck on the county road. Then it came, one low note, so soft Mason almost mistook it for the blood moving in his own ears. It rose from somewhere inside the workshop, deep and steady, no louder than a breath held against wood. It did not sound like music exactly. It sounded like something old, remembering how to speak. Mason's hand slipped from the key. Ranger leaned forward until his nose nearly touched the bottom of the door. The note trembled, faded, then returned when the wind moved over the roofline. Mason stood very still. He had not believed in signs for a long time. Signs were what people named coincidences after they were tired of being afraid. But this did not feel like coincidence. A sealed workshop should not have had a voice. A dead building should not have been humming. And a man who had spent years trying not to hear his own heart should not have felt it answer. "Ranger," he whispered, his throat tighter than he expected. "What did we just buy?" The dog did not turn. He only sat down before the door, solemn as a guard at the entrance to a chapel, listening to the note as if he had been waiting for it all along. Mason did not open the door right away. He stood with the key in his palm and the low note moving through the boards beneath his boots, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something inside him pause instead of brace. Ranger stayed seated at his side, steady and patient, as if the dog understood that some doors were heavier than wood. Mason had spent most of his life walking into places other people were trying to leave, flooded towns in Louisiana, washed-out roads in Kentucky, temporary bridges in places where the old ones had given up during storms. He had served as an army engineer, which sounded clean when printed on a form, but the work had never been clean. It had been mud, sweat, bent metal, sleepless coffee, field maps soft from rain, and the stubborn belief that if you could make a road passable, or a generator hum, or a roof hold through one more night, then maybe people could begin again. Mason had been good at that. Good with beams, wire, pressure, angles, failure points. Good at looking at a damaged thing and seeing not the ruin, but the sequence required to make it stand. The trouble began after he came home and realized no one had handed him a blueprint for himself. Civilian life did not collapse loudly. It sagged in quiet places. A room too still, a grocery aisle too bright, a phone that never rang unless it was a bill collector, or someone checking in with the careful voice people used around a man they believed might break. He worked construction for a while outside Eugene, then maintenance at a marina, then odd repair jobs from strangers who liked his work but did not know what to do with his silences. He was polite. He paid cash. He kept his truck clean. He answered questions with just enough words to make people stop asking. At night, he rented a small room behind a hardware store and listened to the building settle around him, every pipe knock and wall creak sharp as a memory. Ranger had come into his life through a veteran support program 3 years earlier, though Mason never liked that phrase. Support sounded like pity wearing office clothes. Ranger was not pity. Ranger was a fact, a warm weight beside the bed, a black nose against Mason's wrist when his breathing changed, a pair of amber eyes that did not ask for explanations. The dog did not care what Mason had done, where he had served, or why some mornings he sat on the edge of the mattress, with his boots untied for 20 minutes, unable to remember what ordinary men did first. Ranger simply waited, and in waiting he taught Mason a kind of respect Mason had forgotten how to give himself. Do not rush the breath, do not force the day, stand, step, listen. That was why Mason had noticed the county notice at all. He had gone in to renew his truck registration and found himself staring at the crooked paper on the bulletin board. Former Hale Pipeworks. Minimum bid $1. The photograph showed a long, tired building half hidden by grass, but something about the shape of it held him. The high windows, the stone base, the cupola like an old lookout. A workshop, not a house, a place made for hands. The clerk told him 3 people had toured it and none had made an offer. Roof leaks, she said. Electricals questionable. No commercial use until inspection. Honestly, Mr. Whitaker, it's a lot. Mason had almost laughed. A lot was the only kind of thing he seemed to understand. So he wrote his name on the bid form, paid the $1 in exact change, and told himself he was only buying space for tools. That was the lie men like Mason told when hope embarrassed them. Now standing before the door, hearing that impossible note, he understood the building had not been waiting for a buyer. It had been waiting for a listener. He unlocked the door. The latch resisted, then gave with a dry click that sounded louder than it should have. The door swung inward on a smell of cedar dust, old oil, mouse-chewed paper, and air shut away too long. Light slipped through broken slats and fell in pale bars across workbenches, clamps, stacked lumber, and rows of covered pipes rising in the dimness like a congregation asleep beneath gray sheets. Mason stepped inside, Ranger close enough that his shoulder brushed Mason's leg. The low note deepened for one breath, then softened, as though the room had recognized them and was deciding whether to trust them. Mason took off his cap. He did not know why. Maybe some places asked that of a person. Maybe respect was the first tool you brought into a forgotten room. Ranger entered Hale Pipeworks as if he had been invited by someone Mason could not see. He did not rush, did not sniff wildly the way ordinary dogs might have in a place full of dust and old wood and the secret lives of mice. He crossed the threshold with the measured care of a working dog, who understood that some rooms held more than scent. Mason watched him move through the dim workshop, past a bench scattered with rusted clamps, past a row of narrow pipes wrapped in yellowing cloth, past a wall where hand tools hung in perfect outlines, though half the tools themselves were gone. Ranger's nails clicked softly on the floorboards, each sound small but certain. He stopped near the center of the room, lowered his head, and listened with his whole body. That was the thing about Ranger most people missed. They saw the broad chest, the sable coat, the black saddle across his back, the calm amber eyes, and they thought strength was the point of him. Mason knew better. Ranger's gift was not strength, it was attention. Years ago, before his muzzle silvered and his left hip stiffened on rainy mornings, Ranger had worked with a search and recovery unit after storms, mudslides, and collapsed buildings. He had been trained to ignore panic, ignore shouting, ignore the 1,000 useless smells that rose from broken places, and find the one thing that mattered. A breath, a shift of air, a living warmth behind plaster. Mason had seen men with machines miss what Ranger caught by lifting one ear. He had seen engineers argue over maps, while Ranger stood beside a cracked foundation and stared at a wall until everyone finally understood the wall was speaking. Not in words. Buildings rarely spoke in words. They groaned, leaned, settled, hissed, held pressure, released it. Ranger knew that language. Maybe that was why Mason trusted him here. Since leaving the service, Mason had struggled with rooms. Some rooms were too loud with memory. Some were too quiet with absence. People tried to help by filling the silence, but Ranger never made that mistake. Ranger did not crowd him with comfort. He simply noticed. If Mason's breath shortened, Ranger leaned against his leg. If Mason stared too long at nothing, Ranger nudged his hand. If Mason woke in the dark with his fists closed around a dream, Ranger climbed halfway onto the bed and pressed his heavy head against Mason's chest until the present returned, one breath at a time. No speeches, no questions, no pity, just the steady fact of another heartbeat. In the workshop, Ranger circled once and stopped again near a wide plank darker than the boards around it. He placed one paw on it, then the other. The low note returned, deeper now, faint enough that Mason had to hold his breath to hear it clearly. It seemed to rise through Ranger's legs before it reached the air, as if the dog had found the pulse of the building. Mason crouched beside him and laid his palm on the floor. At first he felt only cool wood. Then, beneath that, a vibration so slight it might have been imagination. A long, rounded hum. Not mechanical, not electric, wind-borne. "You hear it under here, don't you?" Mason whispered. Ranger blinked once, slow and serious. Mason almost smiled. There were people in town who would have laughed at him for talking to a dog like a partner. But those people had never been led out of their own darkness by 4 patient paws. They had never watched a creature listen without judgment. Mason looked around the shop again, and the place changed in his mind. The covered pipes no longer looked like junk waiting for disposal. They looked like throats closed around songs. The benches no longer looked abandoned. They looked interrupted. Even the dust seemed less like neglect and more like a blanket pulled over something sleeping. Ranger lowered himself beside the dark plank, rested his chin on his paws, and kept his ears lifted toward the floor. Mason knew that posture. It meant stay. It meant pay attention. It meant the answer was not gone, only hidden. Outside, wind moved through the cupola and brushed the high windows with a dry, papery sound. Inside, the note trembled again, soft as a memory returning carefully to a room where it was not sure it would be welcome. Mason sat back on his heels, his hands still on the plank, and felt a strange humility settle over him. He had bought the workshop with $1. Ranger somehow had begun to purchase its trust. By noon, Mason had opened every window that would move and given up on 3 that would not. The workshop breathed in pieces. Dust lifted where sunlight touched it, slow and golden, turning the air into something almost visible. Ranger followed him from bench to bench, never far, pausing now and then to study the floor, as if the boards were still telling him secrets in a voice too low for Mason's ears. On the west wall, beneath a curl of peeling paint, Mason found a row of old photographs pinned behind cracked glass. Men in aprons stood beside pipes taller than doorways. A woman in a Sunday hat smiled beside a small chapel organ. An elderly man with narrow shoulders and large hands leaned against the loading door, one palm resting on a wooden pipe as if it were the shoulder of an old friend. His hair was white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes held a brightness Mason recognized, not happiness exactly, purpose. Written below the photograph in faded ink were 2 words, Arthur Hale. Mason said the name aloud softly. Ranger's ears twitched. The next morning, Mason drove into Bellwether Falls and parked outside the town library, a brick building with ivy crawling up one corner and a flag snapping gently above the steps. Ranger waited in the truck with the windows cracked, watching the sidewalk with calm authority. Inside, the library smelled of paper, coffee, and lemon oil. Behind the front desk sat Evelyn Mercer, 68, silver-haired, straight-backed, with reading glasses hanging from a chain, and the sharp, kind eyes of a woman who had spent her life noticing what other people misplaced. When Mason asked about Hale Pipeworks, her expression changed before she answered. Not surprise, recognition. Arthur Hale, she said, touching the edge of the desk with 2 fingers. Now there was a man who believed wood had memory. She led Mason to a small local history room where newspaper clippings rested in binders and town records sat in boxes labeled by decade. As she turned the pages, Hale Pipeworks began to rise out of dust and ink. Arthur had opened the shop in 1979 after apprenticing in Pennsylvania and working for a large organ builder in Ohio. He came west with his wife, Margaret, a box of tools, and a belief that sound could hold a community together better than speeches ever could. He built organs for churches, restored theater pipes, repaired school instruments, and tuned whatever the town could not afford to replace. He wasn't rich, Evelyn said. Not even close. But he treated every job like it belonged in a cathedral. Mason read the clippings carefully. Arthur Hale installs new pipe rank at Grange Hall. Hale repairs storm-damaged chapel organ at no cost. Bellwether Theater reopens with music after 20 years of silence. In every photograph, Arthur stood slightly to the side, never centered, never reaching for attention. Mason understood that kind of man. Some people did the work and stepped away before applause could make things awkward. Evelyn pulled out a ledger wrapped in brown paper. He kept copies here after the county asked for documentation on historic craft businesses. Most folks forgot, I didn't. Inside were lines of neat handwriting. Cedar flute pipe repaired, bellows patched, voicing adjusted, invoice waived. Beside one entry Arthur had written, "Let them keep singing." Mason read that line twice. Something in his chest tightened, not painfully, but as if an old knot had shifted. Why did the shop close? He asked. Evelyn looked toward the window, where maple leaves moved like small flames beyond the glass. Margaret passed in 2009. Arthur kept working for a while, but the town changed. Small churches merged. The theater stopped booking musicians. People wanted cheaper electronic replacements. He closed the doors in 2011. Said he was tired, but I don't think that was the whole truth. She paused, then added, he was building something before the end, a community organ. He called it the Bellwether Voice. Said a town ought to have one place where every person could sit in the same room and feel the same note under their feet. Mason thought of the low hum beneath the workshop floor, Ranger lying beside that dark plank like a guardian. Did he finish it? Evelyn shook her head. No. But Arthur was not the kind of man who left a thing without a reason. She removed a final clipping from the folder. It showed Arthur standing outside the shop beside a massive covered shape. The caption read, "Local builder begins legacy project." Mason stared at the picture until the room around him quieted. The shape under the canvas had the same outline as the pipe hidden beneath the tarp in the workshop. Before he left, Evelyn wrote her number on a library card and slid it across the table. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. Arthur had a saying. He used it for instruments, but I always thought he meant people too. Never force a voice. Every voice deserves the dignity of being heard cleanly. Mason folded the card and put it in his shirt pocket. Outside, Ranger lifted his head as Mason approached, amber eyes steady through the glass. Mason opened the truck door and sat for a moment before starting the engine. "Arthur Hale," he said, looking back toward the ridge road. "Looks like we're not the first ones who thought old things deserved another chance." Ranger leaned his shoulder into Mason's arm, and together they drove back toward the workshop that was beginning, very slowly, to have a name again. Mason spent the next week learning the workshop the way a cautious man learns a new town, one corner at a time, without assuming welcome. He swept paths through the dust, carried out broken crates, patched a strip of roof with tar paper, and labeled anything that looked too deliberate to throw away. Ranger kept his own schedule. Each morning, while Mason pried open swollen drawers or tested joists with the heel of his boot, the old German shepherd made his rounds. Loading door, west bench, covered pipe ranks, center plank, back wall, then the same center plank again. Always back to that one place. By the 7th day, Mason had stopped pretending it was coincidence. The note did not sound every hour. It came when the wind moved from the west, sliding down the ridge and over the cupola. Some days it was only a shiver under the boards. Other days, especially near dusk, it swelled enough to make the empty jars on Arthur Hale's workbench tremble against one another with a faint glassy tick. Mason began to hear shape in it, not a moan, not a draft, a tone, low-rounded, patient, a note built, not found. On Thursday afternoon, with rain clouds gathering but no rain yet falling, Ranger stood at the rear door and gave one firm tap of his paw. Mason looked up from a box of brittle invoices. "You giving orders now?" Ranger tapped again, then glanced toward the back field. Mason took the hint. Outside, the grass behind Hale Pipeworks sloped toward a basalt outcrop, half hidden by fern and Oregon grape. The building's stone foundation ran deeper on this side, dark with moss, and blackberry vines had grown over what looked at first like a drainage trench. Ranger pushed his nose into the leaves, sneezed once, and pawed at the soil. Mason knelt beside him. Under the vines was a narrow wooden grill, weathered gray but still intact, set into the base of the foundation like an old vent. He cleared it with his gloved hands. Cool air breathed out against his wrist, not stale cellar air, fresh moving. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. Ranger's ears lifted, pleased but dignified, as if he had expected Mason to catch up eventually. Mason followed the foundation line and found 2 more grills, then a shallow stone channel leading from the outcrop to the rear wall. It had been hidden under years of fallen leaves, but the workmanship was unmistakable. The stones were fitted carefully, angled to guide air, not water. Arthur Hale had not simply built a workshop on this ridge. He had built with the ridge. Back inside, Mason pulled Arthur's old drawings across a bench and weighted the corners with brass clamps. The plans were difficult at first, layered with measurements, hand notations, and symbols Mason did not yet understand. But he understood airflow. Pressure, intention. Slowly the lines began to make sense. A west wind entered through the stone channel, passed under the foundation, narrowed through a wooden throat beneath the floor, and rose toward the base of the large base pipe hidden near the center of the shop. The cupola above was not decorative. It drew air upward. The entire structure was a lung. Mason sat back, almost laughing, except the feeling in him was too reverent for laughter. Arthur had designed a building that could breathe one note after he was gone. Not loudly, not for applause, just enough to say, "I am still here." Ranger lay beside the dark plank, chin down, eyes on Mason. The wind strengthened outside, a few dry leaves spun against the windows. Then the note came again, fuller than before, traveling up through stone, wood, pipe, and dust, until the whole room seemed to hold it in its ribs. Mason placed both hands flat on the floor. He thought of temporary bridges and field repairs, of all the structures he had fixed, so other people could cross from danger into morning. He thought of himself after coming home, sealed up in silence, still standing but afraid to let any wind through. You didn't abandon it, he whispered to the room, to Arthur, to whoever still cared about such things. You taught it how to keep breathing. Ranger exhaled beside him, a long, warm breath that seemed to join the fading note. For the first time since buying the place, Mason did not see a project. He saw a promise, and promises, he knew, were heavier than repairs. The base pipe stood near the center of the workshop beneath a canvas tarp so old it had softened into the color of dry ash. Mason had walked past it a dozen times, touched the edge of it twice, and still had not been ready to uncover it. Some objects asked for tools. Others asked for permission. This one seemed to ask for both. On Friday morning, the wind came clear from the west, moving through the stone channel behind the building, with enough strength to wake the low note, before Mason had even unlocked the front door. Ranger was waiting at the steps, tail still, ears lifted, his whole body angled toward the sound. Mason opened the shop, and the note rolled out to meet them, low and rounded, not loud, but deep enough to make the loose glass in the high windows hum in sympathy. "All right," Mason said quietly. "Today, then." Ranger walked straight to the covered pipe and sat beside it. Mason removed the tarp slowly. Dust slid off in pale sheets. Beneath it stood a wooden pipe nearly 7 feet tall, square-shouldered and broad at the base, built from dark cedar polished by age until the grain looked like flowing water. Its mouth had been cut with extraordinary care, the upper lip beveled thin, the lower lip warm with a faint amber shine where hands had touched it many times. Mason had seen bridges, doors, beams, and church rafters made by people who cared. But this was different. This was not carpentry alone. This was listening made visible. Near the foot of the pipe, half hidden beneath a line of dust, he noticed words carved small enough that a careless eye would miss them. "For the one who still listens." Mason read the sentence once, then again. It did not feel like an inscription. It felt like being addressed. Ranger leaned forward and sniffed the base, then gave a soft huff. Mason knelt, running his fingers along the seam where the foot met the pipe body. The joinery was clean but not sealed permanently. 4 brass screws held a small access plate in place. He found a screwdriver in Arthur Hale's tool rack, wiped the handle against his jeans, and began working each screw loose. No hurry, no forcing. Arthur's words, passed through Evelyn, came back to him as if they belonged in his own mouth now. Never force a voice. The plate came free with a sigh of trapped dust. Inside was not empty space, as Mason expected, but a hollow chamber lined with waxed cloth. Tucked within it sat a narrow metal box wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine so carefully that Mason paused before touching it. Ranger shifted closer, nose inches from Mason's wrist. "I know," Mason murmured. "Feels like opening somebody's chest." He carried the box to the workbench and untied the twine. Inside lay a leather notebook, a bundle of slender tuning tools, 3 folded blueprints, a small brass key darkened with age, and an envelope sealed with cream-colored wax. Mason did not open the envelope right away. His hands had begun to tremble, not from fear, but from the strange intimacy of being trusted by a dead man. The notebook came first. Arthur's handwriting was neat, narrow, patient. Wind tests, October 2008. Bass pipe responds best when west channel is clear. Do not overvoice. Let the building provide the breath. Several pages later, a line stopped Mason cold. If this note is heard after I am gone, the shop has found its witness. Mason looked at Ranger. The dog watched him with solemn amber eyes, as if witness was a duty he understood. Mason opened the envelope last. The letter inside began without ceremony. To whoever purchased Hale Pipeworks and heard the low C before seeing the pipe, thank you for listening before deciding. Most people decide first. Mason lowered himself onto the stool. Arthur wrote of the unfinished bellwether voice, of his hope that the workshop might one day become more than a private shop, of a town that needed a room where no one was measured by money, age, usefulness, polish, or past mistakes. Then came the final line. The key is not for the front door. The next answer is beneath the place where Ranger. No, not Ranger, Mason realized with a faint, stunned breath, where any honest dog would choose to lie. Mason turned. Ranger was already back at the dark plank in the center of the floor, lying down with his chin on his paws, listening. Ranger did not move when Mason crossed the room. He stayed stretched across the dark plank as if his body had been placed there by some older instruction, patient, certain, untroubled by the weight of what might be waiting underneath. Mason knelt beside him and ran his hand over the floorboards. The plank was wider than the others, darker too, not from rot but from age and handling. Along its edge, almost hidden beneath a seam of dust, he found a small brass circle no bigger than a dime. A keyhole. For a moment Mason simply stared at it. The workshop had gone very quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause outside the high windows, leaving the room with the kind of silence that gathers before a hymn begins. "You knew," Mason said softly. Ranger lifted his eyes, then lowered them again toward the plank. Mason took the brass key from his shirt pocket. It resisted halfway, then turned with a clean, delicate click. Something under the floor released, not dramatically, not like a movie. Just one honest sound from a piece of hardware doing the work it had been made to do. Mason slipped his fingers into the ring and pulled. The plank rose on hidden hinges, slow and heavy, breathing out the scent of dry cedar, old paper and metal kept safe from damp for many patient years. Beneath it was not a room large enough to stand in, but a narrow storage chamber built between the joists, lined with tin and waxed wood, as carefully made as a hope chest. Mason brought over a work light and lowered it into the opening. The glow revealed a small cedar trunk, a canvas tool roll, 3 long boxes labeled by pipe rank, and a gray fireproof cash box with Arthur Hale's initials painted in a careful hand, A.H. Mason climbed down one step, then another, his boots touching the hidden floor. Ranger remained above, watching over the opening like a sentry at a quiet gate. Mason lifted the cedar trunk first. It was not locked. Inside lay dozens of small wooden pipes wrapped in cloth, each one labeled in pencil: Bellwether Voice, Upper Flute, Community Hall Division, Final Voicing Pending. They were beautiful in an unfinished way, smooth but not polished, waiting for breath. Under them lay a folded document sealed in plastic. Mason opened it and read slowly. It was a letter of intent, witnessed and notarized in 2010, naming Hale Pipeworks itself as the vessel for Arthur's final project. Whoever legally acquired the property, if willing to restore the workshop and complete the Bellwether Voice for public use, would be entitled to Arthur's remaining tools, plans, and restoration fund. Mason sat back on his heels. Entitled was the word on the page, but it did not feel like entitlement. It felt like trust. He opened the cash box last. Inside were bank envelopes, savings bonds, and a ledger bound with a rubber band gone brittle. The total, written on the first page in Arthur's hand, came to $30,000 even. Restoration fund. Not inheritance for comfort. Not reward for curiosity. Money with a purpose. Beneath the ledger was a list of names. Churches, senior centers, a small theater, a union hall, a community college music room, and beside many of them the same words Mason had seen before: no charge. Let them keep singing. He read the line again and felt something give way in him, not breaking exactly, but loosening. All those years, Arthur had worked on voices no one else thought worth saving, because they belonged to places without money. Mason thought about how easily people did that with one another too. Measured a person by polish, income, usefulness, conversation, confidence. Decided who deserved patience and who should be replaced. He looked up at Ranger, who had never once asked Mason to be more impressive before choosing to stay. It wasn't buried treasure, Mason whispered. It was a promise with cash attached. Ranger gave a soft breath through his nose. Mason placed the documents back with care, as if rough hands might bruise the meaning. Then he found one last envelope tucked beneath the tool roll. On it Arthur had written, "If you cannot finish it, protect it until someone can." Mason held that sentence for a long time. He had spent years believing unfinished meant failed, but here, under a forgotten floor, an unfinished thing had been protected, labeled, funded, and left with dignity. Maybe that was what respect truly looked like. Not pretending damage was not real, not rushing repair, simply refusing to throw away what still had a voice. The news moved through Bellwether Falls faster than Mason expected, though no one ever admitted to carrying it. By Monday morning, the woman at the gas station knew he had found something under the floor. By Tuesday, the man at the feed store asked whether the old Hale place was worth real money now. By Wednesday, a White County pickup stopped at the edge of the property, and Douglas Pike stepped out wearing pressed khakis, clean boots, and the expression of a man who had already made up his mind and was only visiting to make the paperwork feel polite. Douglas was on the town development board, a tall, narrow man with silver hair combed flat, and a voice that never rose because it did not need to. He looked at the patched roof, the open windows, the piles of cleared brush, and Ranger lying in the shade beside the loading door. Mr. Whitaker, he said, I hear you've found historical materials. Mason wiped his hands on a rag. I found what Arthur Hale left for the workshop. Douglas smiled without warmth. That may complicate things. Mason had learned that sentence years ago. It usually meant someone was about to take a simple truth and put a fence around it. Douglas explained that the town had received renewed interest from a storage company based in Salem. The land, he said, was usable. The building was not. Bellwether Falls needed tax revenue more than nostalgia. A private restoration by a man with no formal organ-building credentials might be charming, but charm did not keep a town solvent. Mason listened without interrupting. Ranger lifted his head once, then set it down again, his eyes never leaving Douglas. Arthur left a restoration fund, Mason said, and a legal letter. $30,000? Douglas gave a small sigh. That won't restore this. Not properly. Mason looked back at the workshop. He knew Douglas was not entirely wrong. The roof needed more than patches. The wiring had to be replaced. The floor had soft spots. The old bellows system might take months to understand. But wrong and right were not always opposites. Sometimes right was only a thing spoken without mercy. Maybe not all at once, Mason said, but enough to begin. Douglas glanced at Ranger. Beginning is easy. After he drove away, Mason stood in the gravel for a long time. The sentence stayed with him because it had teeth. Beginning was easy. Staying was the hard part. He had begun many things after leaving the army. Jobs, leases, therapy appointments, friendships he quietly let fade when people got too close to the locked rooms inside him. He knew how to start over. He did not know how to stay long enough to be seen failing. That evening, he sat on the workshop floor beside the hidden chamber. Arthur's plans spread around him, and felt the old pressure build behind his ribs. The town would watch now. Some would hope. Some would doubt. Some would wait for him to prove that men like him were better at leaving than belonging. Ranger came over and pressed his forehead against Mason's shoulder, not hard, just enough. Mason closed his eyes. The low pipe answered the wind with a faint, patient tone. The next morning, Mason put a sign by the road. Capipal Works Cleanup Saturday, 9 a.m., every voice welcome. He expected Evelyn, maybe one curious retiree. 12 people came, then 16. A former electrician named Marla Reyes brought coffee and inspected the panel. A retired cabinet maker named Walt Boone ran his palm along the pipe racks and said, "Good cedar. Don't let anybody tell you this is junk." Evelyn arrived with folders of photographs and set up a table labeled Memory Donations. People wrote what they remembered. First dances at the old theater, Sunday hymns, a funeral song that helped a widow stand, Arthur fixing a broken reed and refusing payment. Mason did not make a speech. He handed out gloves, labeled salvage piles, answered questions when he could, and admitted when he could not. By afternoon, the workshop sounded different. Brooms moved, windows opened. Laughter rose carefully as if unsure whether the room would accept it. Ranger walked among the volunteers, calm and watchful, accepting gentle pats from weathered hands, then returning to Mason whenever his breathing tightened. Near sunset, Douglas Pike stopped again, but did not come inside. He stood at the road, watching light spill through the high windows for the first time in years. Mason saw him, then turned back to help Walt lift a workbench upright. He did not need to win with words. Not today. Today the building had people inside it. Today no one had been measured by usefulness alone. Today the old workshop was not restored, not yet, but respected. And sometimes respect was the first true repair. The first public sound of the bellwether voice was not scheduled like a concert. Mason refused the word concert every time Evelyn used it, because a concert suggested polished shoes, printed programs, and people pretending they were not holding their breath. This was only a test, he told everyone. A trial of wind and wood, nothing more. Yet by 7 o'clock on a mild April evening, folding chairs had appeared outside the open loading door, coffee steamed from paper cups, and half the town seemed to be standing in the grass, as if some long-closed window in Bellwether Falls had finally been raised. The workshop glowed from within. New wiring ran safely along the beams. The repaired windows caught the last peach-colored light, and the old pipes stood uncovered in their ranks, some shining, some scarred, each one cleaned and labeled by hands that had learned to move with care. Mason stood at the center console Arthur Hale had begun, but never finished, one palm resting on the rail, the other hovering above the wind lever. He had rebuilt bridges under rain, set temporary power in towns with no lights, and slept beside machines louder than thought, but he could not remember feeling as exposed as he did before that room. His shirt clung lightly to his back, his mouth was dry. Every doubt Douglas Pike had ever spoken stood up inside him, wearing Mason's own voice. Not enough training, not enough money, not enough right to touch another man's dream. Ranger lay beside the console, silvered muzzle, resting on his paws, ears raised toward the pipe ranks. Evelyn stood near the workbench with Arthur's ledger against her chest. Walt Boone leaned on his cane by the east wall. Marla Reyes watched the new panel like a mother watching a sleeping stove. Even Douglas had come, though he remained just outside the doorway, arms folded, face unreadable in the dusk. Mason looked at the people gathered there and felt the terrible kindness of their attention. They were not waiting to be entertained. They were waiting to know whether something they had almost lost could speak again. He pulled the lever. Air moved. Mason felt it in the floor first, a pressure waking below his boots, traveling through the channels Arthur had shaped, rising into the wooden lungs of the instrument. A faint rustle passed through the pipes, then nothing, no note, no tremor. Only the soft click of the lever settling into place and the huge, embarrassing silence after expectation. Mason's hand tightened around the rail. Someone outside shifted in a chair. The room seemed to grow larger around him. Too large, large enough to hold every unfinished thing he had ever walked away from. He reached for the lever again, ready to shut the system down, to call it a first attempt, to protect the instrument from his own failure. Ranger stood. The movement was slow but certain. He stepped around Mason, nose low, and went to the footboard beneath the console. Mason frowned. He had checked that board twice. Ranger placed one paw on a small wooden pedal tucked half an inch deeper than the rest, almost hidden by the console frame. Not a dramatic strike, just pressure, a reminder. Mason looked down, then at Arthur's mark drawing pin nearby, auxiliary bass valve. Manual release, his breath caught. "Of course," he whispered. "Arthur, you old fox." He placed his boot beside Ranger's paw and pressed. This time the wind did not scatter. It gathered. The great bass pipe answered first, the same low C that had called Mason from the doorway months before. But now it did not sound alone. A second note rose above it, then a third, soft and clear as light spreading under a door. The workshop changed. Boards, beams, glass jars, brass tools, even the dust in the upper rafters seemed to receive the sound and give it back warmer. No one clapped. Not yet. The people stood inside the note as if applause would have been too small a language for it. Evelyn covered her mouth. Walt lowered his head. Marla closed her eyes. Outside the doorway, Douglas Pike unfolded his arms. Mason felt Ranger lean against his legs, solid, living, certain. The music was imperfect. One pipe wavered. Another arrived late. A high flute trembled at the edge of tune. But nothing about it felt broken. It felt human. Mason kept the wind steady, and for the first time in years, he did not feel like a man pretending to be whole. He felt like a man allowed to be unfinished and still useful, still worthy, still heard. Hale Pipeworks no longer looked like a place the county had forgotten how to value. The grass was cut, the windows shone, and the old sign above the door had been restored rather than replaced, because Mason said scars earned honestly should not be sanded out of everything. Beneath the original name, Evelyn painted a smaller line in steady blue letters, the Hale Listening House. People still called it the workshop, but they said it differently now, with a kind of warmth in the mouth. On Tuesday mornings, Walt Boone taught basic wood repair at the East Bench, his hands crooked with age but sure as prayer. On Thursdays, Marla Reyes showed volunteers how to read old wiring diagrams without fear. Once a month, Mason opened the pipe room and explained how wind became tone, how pressure needed patience, how a pipe spoke best when it was not forced, how even a small obstruction could turn a clear voice into a strained one. He never turned those lessons into sermons. He did not need to. People heard what they were ready to hear. A retired mail carrier touched a newly voiced flute pipe and whispered that it reminded him of his wife's hymns. A quiet mechanic from the next county came every Saturday and said almost nothing for 6 weeks. Then one day repaired a cracked stop knob so beautifully that Mason gave him a drawer for his tools. Veterans came too, not because Mason advertised the place as healing, but because word traveled in the private ways of people who carried too much and trusted too little. They came for coffee, for the steadiness of work, for the relief of standing beside others without being asked to explain themselves. Ranger became the first greeting most visitors received. He slept near the great bass pipe in the afternoons, rising only when someone new hesitated at the door. Then he would walk over, slow and dignified, and offer his head beneath a hand as if to say, "You may enter as you are." The $30,000 Arthur had left did not last forever, but it lasted long enough to become a seed. Mason used it carefully: roof, safety work, missing parts, insurance, a modest fund for repairs at community spaces that could not afford them. The ledger remained on display in a glass case, open to the page where Arthur had written, "No charge, let them keep singing." Beside it, Mason placed a new notebook. The first page read, "No proof of worth required." By August, the bellwether voice could play 5 full pieces, though Mason loved the first low note best. It still came, when the west wind moved through the stone channel, still rose through the floor like a memory with breath in it. One evening, after the last visitor had gone and the sky had turned the color of warm copper, Mason stood alone in the workshop with Ranger at his side. Tools hung in their outlines. Pipes rested in their ranks. Dust no longer ruled the room. Light did. Mason ran his hand along the console rail Arthur had shaped years before and thought about the dollar he had paid. The key hidden in the pipe, the chamber under the floor. The town that had almost traded a voice for storage units, and the dog who had heard what a man nearly missed. Ranger leaned against his leg, heavier now than he used to be, but still steady. Mason looked down at him and smiled, small and real. "You brought me home, didn't you?" Ranger gave a soft breath, then turned his ears toward the floor. The west wind arrived gently. The great pipe answered. Not lonely this time, not pleading, just present. Mason locked the door later than usual, pausing on the steps while the last note faded into the summer dark. He understood then that inheritance was not always blood, and property was not always possession. Sometimes a person inherited a task, a trust, a chance to treat forgotten things with dignity. Sometimes respect was not a grand gesture at all, but the choice to listen before judging, to repair before replacing, to make room before asking someone to sing. Behind him, Hale Pipeworks stood quiet but not silent, and beside him Ranger waited, ears lifted, ready as ever to hear the next true thing. If this story touched something in you, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. And I'd love to know, which moment stayed with you most? The first low note, Ranger's discovery, or Mason choosing to restore the old workshop?